the Machete murderer, the Juan Corona story. In the heart of California's fertile Central Valley, where endless rows of peach trees stretch toward the horizon, lies some of America's most productive agricultural land. It was here, along the banks of the Feather River in Sutter County, that thousands of migrant workers came each season seeking honest work and the promise of the American dream. But in the spring of 1971, this pastoral landscape would become the setting for one of the most shocking mass murder cases in American history. 25 bodies would be discovered buried in shallow graves among the peach orchards, all victims of a man who had promised them work, but delivered death instead. This is the story of Juan Corona Vallejo, known as the Machete Murderer, whose crimes would make him America's deadliest known serial killer until Dean Corll's victims were discovered 2 years later. The early 1970s marked a period of significant change in American agriculture. California's Central Valley had become the nation's breadbasket, producing fruits and vegetables that fed the entire country. This agricultural abundance depended heavily on migrant workers, men who traveled from farm to farm, season to season, following the harvest cycles that determined their survival. These were often marginalized individuals, undocumented immigrants, drifters, men with criminal records, and those who had fallen through society's cracks. They lived on the fringes of American society, working back-breaking jobs for minimal pay, sleeping in labor camps or wherever they could find shelter. Their transient lifestyle made them largely invisible to mainstream society and perfect targets for someone with violent intentions. In this world of invisible workers and endless labor contractors held enormous power. They served as intermediaries between farm owners and workers, determining who got hired, where they slept, and how much they earned. For migrant workers, a labor contractor could mean the difference between survival and destitution. But for one contractor in Sutter County, this position of trust would become a tool for murder. Juan Corona Vallejo was born on February 7, 1934, in San Antonio de los Moran, Ayutla, in the Mexican state of Jalisco. He grew up in rural poverty, one of many children in a family that struggled to survive in Mexico's challenging economic conditions. Like millions of other Mexicans, Corona would eventually look north to the United States for opportunities that didn't exist in his homeland. In 1950, at the age of 16, Corona made his first illegal crossing into the United States through the California border. He was following a path already taken by 4 brothers and 1 sister, all seeking the economic opportunities that America promised. Corona's early experience in the U.S. was typical of many undocumented immigrants. He found work picking carrots and melons in the Imperial Valley, backbreaking labor that paid little but offered hope for something better. After 3 months in the Imperial Valley, Corona moved north to the Sacramento Valley, where the agricultural opportunities were more diverse and potentially more lucrative. This migration pattern, from Mexico to Southern California to the Central Valley, was well established among Mexican agricultural workers, and Corona was following a route that thousands had taken before him. Corona's transition to life in California was facilitated by his half-brother, Jose Natividad Corona Sanchez, who had already established himself in the Marysville, Yuba City area. It was Natividad who suggested that Juan move to this region in May 1953, where he found work on a local ranch. This family connection would prove crucial to Corona's eventual criminal career, but it would also foreshadow the violence that lay ahead. Natividad Corona had his own troubled history with violence. He had attacked a man named Romero Raya with a machete-like weapon at his cafe in Marysville, an assault that resulted in a lawsuit. After losing the civil case, Natividad fled back to Mexico, establishing a pattern of violence followed by escape that would later become relevant to his brother's case. Juan Corona appeared to be building a more stable life than his brother. In October 1953, he married Gabriela E. Hermosillo in Reno, Nevada. 5 years later, he married Gloria Fer Moreno, with whom he would have 4 daughters, Martha Victoria, Yolanda, and Guadalupe. Corona became a regular attendee at St. Isidore's Roman Catholic Church, presenting the image of a hard-working, family-oriented immigrant pursuing the American dream. Behind Corona's facade of stability, however, serious mental health issues were developing. In January 1956, following what was described as a schizophrenic episode, Natividad had Corona committed to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California. This involuntary commitment revealed the severity of Corona's psychological problems and marked the beginning of a pattern of mental health crises that would continue throughout his life. At DeWitt State Hospital, Corona was diagnosed with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type, a serious mental illness that could explain many of his subsequent behaviors. The treatment he received was brutal by today's standards. 23 electroconvulsive therapy sessions designed to shock his brain into normal functioning. After 3 months, he was declared recovered and released, but was immediately deported to Mexico. This experience with mental illness and institutionalization would prove to be a turning point in Corona's life. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, combined with the trauma of forced electroshock treatment, may have contributed to the violent tendencies that would later emerge. The deportation also reinforced his status as an outsider, someone who existed on the margins of American society. In 1962, Corona was granted a green card and returned to the United States legally, marking a significant change in his immigration status. He was now a legal permanent resident with the right to work and live in the United States indefinitely. This legal status would prove crucial to his later career as a labor contractor, as it gave him legitimacy that many other migrant workers lacked. Corona established himself as a hard-working and reliable employee, though those who knew him described him as someone with schizophrenic episodes and a violent temper. Despite these concerning traits, he was able to obtain a license as a labor contractor, putting him in charge of hiring fruit ranch workers throughout the Central Valley. This position gave him enormous power over the lives of migrant workers and access to the most vulnerable members of the agricultural workforce. The role of labor contractor was perfect for someone with Corona's background and psychological issues. It required minimal oversight, involved working with transient populations who had little contact with authorities, and provided opportunities to exploit desperate people. For someone with violent tendencies, it offered access to victims who were unlikely to be missed if they disappeared. Corona's mental health problems did not disappear with his return to the United States. In March 1970, he was again admitted to DeWitt State Hospital for treatment, indicating that his schizophrenic condition was ongoing and severe enough to require institutional care. This second hospitalization should have raised red flags about his fitness to continue working as a labor contractor, but no action was taken. By March 1971, Corona's personal life was deteriorating. He applied for welfare benefits but was denied, suggesting that his income as a labor contractor was not sufficient to support his family. This financial stress, combined with his ongoing mental health issues, may have contributed to the escalation in violence that was about to begin. Corona was becoming increasingly desperate and unstable, a dangerous combination for someone with access to vulnerable workers. On May 19, 1971, a farm owner who regularly used Corona's services to hire field workers noticed something unusual in his peach orchard. There was a freshly dug hole that seemed out of place among the carefully tended trees. The following day, the hole had been filled in, but the farmer's suspicions were aroused enough to investigate further. What the farmer discovered when he excavated the filled hole would shock the quiet agricultural community of Sutter County and launch one of the largest murder investigations in California history. Buried in the shallow grave was the body of a man who had been stabbed and hacked to death. The brutality of the killing and the crude burial suggested that this was not an isolated incident, but possibly part of a larger pattern of violence. The location of the grave was significant. It was on property where Corona regularly brought workers, and it was in an isolated area where someone could dig and bury a body without being observed. The discovery launched an immediate investigation that would soon reveal the true scope of Corona's crimes and transform him from a trusted labor contractor into one of America's most notorious serial killers. As investigators began searching the surrounding area, they quickly realized they were dealing with something far more extensive than a single murder. The discovery of additional graves revealed a systematic pattern of killing and burial that suggested a serial killer had been operating in the area for months, possibly years. The evidence found in the graves began to point toward Corona almost immediately. In one grave, deputies discovered 2 meat receipts bearing Corona's signature. In 2 other graves, investigators found crumpled Bank of America deposit slips printed with Corona's name and address. This circumstantial evidence created a clear connection between the labor contractor and the buried victims. Witnesses began coming forward with crucial information that further implicated Corona. Several people reported that some of the victims had been last seen riding in Corona's pickup truck, the same vehicle he used to transport workers to and from job sites. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Corona was using his position as a labor contractor to lure victims to isolated locations where he could kill them without witnesses. In the early morning hours of May 26, 1971, police arrived at Corona's Yuba City home with a search warrant. The arrest of the labor contractor sent shockwaves through the migrant worker community, where Corona had been a familiar and trusted figure. For investigators, however, the search of his home provided crucial evidence that confirmed their suspicions about his guilt. The evidence seized from Corona's home painted a picture of a man who had been systematically planning and executing murders. Police found 2 blood-stained knives, a machete, a pistol, and blood-stained clothing, all items that could have been used in the commission of the murders. The discovery of weapons and bloody clothing in his possession provided physical evidence linking Corona directly to the crimes. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of a work ledger that contained 34 names and dates, including 7 of the known victims. Prosecutors would later refer to this ledger as a death list, arguing that it recorded the dates when the men were murdered. The systematic nature of the record-keeping suggested that Corona was not killing in fits of rage, but was methodically planning and documenting his crimes. The 25 victims of Juan Corona shared tragic similarities that revealed both the systematic nature of his crimes and the vulnerability of his chosen targets. All were middle-aged men, mostly between the ages of 47 and 64, with only 3 exceptions. They were the invisible men of American society, drifters, migrant workers, and individuals with criminal records who lived on the margins and were unlikely to be missed if they disappeared. Most of the victims were Caucasian males who had come to the Central Valley seeking work in the agricultural fields. Many had criminal records or histories of alcoholism that had left them homeless and dependent on day labor for survival. They were men who slept in labor camps, abandoned buildings, or wherever they could find shelter, making them perfect targets for someone who wanted to kill without detection. The method of killing was remarkably consistent. All but one of the victims were stabbed or slashed with a knife or machete, with only William Emery Camp being shot in the head with a 9mm pistol. The use of bladed weapons, particularly the machete, would earn Corona his nickname as the Machete Murderer and suggested a killer who was comfortable with close contact violence. Corona was initially provided with legal aid and assigned public defender Roy Van den Heuvel, who immediately recognized the complexity and high-profile nature of the case. Van den Heuvel hired several psychiatrists to perform psychological evaluations of Corona, understanding that mental illness might be a crucial factor in both understanding the crimes and mounting a defense. However, on June 14, 1971, Van den Heuvel was replaced by Richard Hawk, a privately retained defense attorney who made a controversial decision that would later become grounds for appeal. In exchange for his legal representation, Hawk negotiated an agreement granting him exclusive literary and dramatic property rights to Corona's life story, including all proceedings against him. Under this agreement, Corona waived attorney-client privilege. Hawk's decision-making raised serious questions about his priorities and competence. Even before examining Corona's medical records or reading psychiatric reports, Hawk decided against having his client plead not guilty by reason of insanity and fired the psychiatrists who had been hired to evaluate him. This decision would later be cited as evidence of incompetent legal representation. It took over a year for Corona's case to come to trial, during which significant legal changes occurred that would affect his potential sentence. On February 18, 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled the death penalty unconstitutional, meaning that Corona would not face capital punishment regardless of the outcome of his trial. This development removed the ultimate penalty from consideration, but did not diminish the seriousness of the charges against him. The trial began on September 11, 1972, at the courthouse in Fairfield, California, more than 60 miles from Yuba City. Defense attorney Hawk had successfully obtained a change of venue from Sutter County to Solano County, arguing that extensive media coverage had made it impossible to find an impartial jury in the area where the crimes occurred. The trial itself was a study in prosecutorial strength versus defense incompetence, while the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Corona, including the physical evidence found in his home, the witness testimony placing victims in his truck, and the damning work ledger. The defense offered virtually nothing in response. Corona was not called to testify in his own defense, and no defense witnesses were called to contradict the prosecution's case. After deliberating for 45 hours, the jury returned its verdict on January 18, 1973. Corona was found guilty of first-degree murder on all 25 counts, making him one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in American history at that time. The conviction represented a complete victory for the prosecution and total failure for the defense. Judge Richard Patton sentenced Corona to 25 terms of life imprisonment to run consecutively without the possibility of parole. However, due to California's Penal Code, Section 669, which mandates that when crimes are punished by life imprisonment, all convictions must be merged and run concurrently, the Department of Corrections announced that Corona would actually be eligible for parole in 7 years. This sentencing contradiction highlighted the complexities of California's criminal justice system and meant that despite being convicted of 25 murders, Corona would not serve the consecutive sentences that Judge Patton had intended. The prospect of parole eligibility after only 7 years shocked victims' families and law enforcement officials who had expected Corona to spend the rest of his life in prison. Corona was initially incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville due to heart irregularities that had developed during his legal proceedings. In December 1973, less than a year into his sentence, Corona became the victim of the same type of violence he had inflicted on others. He was stabbed 32 times in his cell by fellow inmates, lost his left eye, and had a blade permanently lodged behind his right eye. The attack was reportedly triggered by a minor incident. Corona had bumped into a fellow inmate in a corridor and failed to say, "Excuse me." This seemingly trivial breach of prison etiquette resulted in a savage assault that nearly killed him. 4 inmates were charged with assault with a deadly weapon in connection with the attack, highlighting the dangerous environment Corona now faced as a high-profile convicted killer. Following his recovery, Corona was transferred to the Correctional Training Facility in Soledad, California. In 1974, his wife Gloria filed for divorce, which was granted on July 30th, severing his final connection to the stable family life he had once maintained. Corona was now truly alone, serving a life sentence in one of California's most dangerous prisons. On May 18, 1978, Corona received news that would give him a second chance at freedom. The California Court of Appeal granted him a new trial based on his appeal and petition for habeas corpus filed by his new lawyers, Alan Axelrod and Michael Mendelson. The appeals court's decision was based on 2 primary issues that had compromised Corona's first trial. First, the court found that trial counsel Richard Hawk had failed to conduct the requisite legal and factual investigations required for competent representation. Second, and perhaps more significantly, Hawk's agreement to obtain publication rights as part of his fee had created an impermissible conflict of interest between the attorney and his client. These findings essentially meant that Corona had been denied his constitutional right to effective legal counsel. The successful appeal was a vindication for those who had argued that Corona's first trial was fundamentally unfair. However, it also meant that the families of the 25 victims would have to endure another trial, and that Corona might potentially be acquitted if the prosecution couldn't prove its case a second time. Corona's second trial began on February 22, 1982 in Hayward, California, nearly 11 years after the murders were discovered. This time, Corona had competent legal representation in the form of attorney Terrence Hallinan, who mounted a vigorous defense that the first trial had completely lacked. The defense strategy focused on Corona's half-brother, Natividad Corona, who had died in Guadalajara in 1973. Hallinan argued that Natividad, not Juan, was the real killer of the ranch workers. The defense pointed to Natividad's history of violence, including his machete attack on Romero Raya and suggested that he had committed the murders before fleeing to Mexico, where he died before he could be brought to justice. This time, more than 50 defense witnesses were called to testify, a stark contrast to the first trial, where no defense witnesses had been presented. Corona himself was called to testify in his own defense, though his testimony was brief and limited. Through an interpreter, he was asked only 2 questions: whether he understood the charges against him and whether he had anything to do with killing the 25 men. His answers were yes and no, respectively. Despite the more vigorous defense, the outcome of the second trial was the same as the first. On September 23, 1982, after deliberating for 54 hours over a 2-week period, the jury again found Corona guilty on all 25 counts of murder. The defense strategy of blaming Natividad had failed to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. The jury foreman later told the press that the most incriminating piece of evidence against Corona was still his work ledger, which the defense had been unable to explain satisfactorily. The systematic record-keeping in the ledger convinced jurors that Corona had been methodically planning and documenting his crimes. The foreman also stated that the jury had dismissed the defense's contention that Natividad committed the murders, noting that he wasn't in Marysville enough to have committed the bulk of the killings. With his second conviction, Corona's legal options were largely exhausted. He had received 2 fair trials with competent legal representation and had been convicted both times by juries that carefully considered all the evidence. The likelihood of successful further appeals was minimal, and Corona faced the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison. In 1992, Corona was transferred from Soledad to Corcoran State Prison in Corcoran, California, where he would spend his final years. Due to developing dementia, he was housed in the Sensitive Needs Yard, SNY, a protective unit for inmates who were vulnerable to attack by the general prison population. Throughout his incarceration, Corona was repeatedly denied parole. He appeared before parole boards 8 times over the course of his sentence, but was never granted release. The severity of his crimes, combined with the large number of victims, made him an unlikely candidate for parole, regardless of his behavior in prison or his advanced age. During a 2011 parole hearing, Corona, then 77 years old and suffering from dementia, reportedly confessed to killing the men. However, by this time, his mental condition had deteriorated significantly, raising questions about the reliability of any statements he made. The confession, if accurate, provided closure for some, but came too late to affect his legal status. Juan Corona died on March 4, 2019, at the age of 85 from natural causes while still incarcerated at Corcoran State Prison. He had served 48 years in prison since his initial conviction, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in California's correctional system. His death marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. Corona's death brought a sense of closure to a case that had haunted California's Central Valley for nearly 5 decades. However, questions about his crimes remained unanswered. Was he truly responsible for all 25 murders, or had some been committed by others? Were there additional victims who were never discovered? What had motivated him to kill so many people in such a systematic way? The Corona case had a profound and lasting impact on migrant worker communities throughout California. The revelation that a trusted labor contractor had been systematically murdering the men he was supposed to help brought new awareness to the vulnerability of agricultural workers and the potential for exploitation by those in positions of authority. The case highlighted the precarious existence of migrant workers in American society. These were men who lived on the margins without family connections, permanent addresses, or official documentation, circumstances that made them perfect victims for a predator. Their invisibility in life had made them vulnerable to violence, and many had been dead for months before anyone noticed they were missing. Following the Corona case, there were increased efforts to provide better protections for migrant workers, including improved oversight of labor contractors and better documentation of worker movements. However, the fundamental vulnerabilities that Corona had exploited, poverty, immigration status, and social isolation, remained largely unchanged. The Corona case became a landmark in American criminal justice for several reasons. It was one of the first major serial killer cases to receive extensive media coverage, helping to establish the template for how such crimes would be reported and investigated in the future. The case also demonstrated the importance of competent legal representation and the consequences of conflicts of interest in criminal defense. The successful appeal of Corona's first conviction based on ineffective assistance of counsel became an important precedent in American criminal law. It established that defendants have a right not just to legal representation, but to competent legal representation free from conflicts of interest. This principle would be cited in numerous subsequent cases involving inadequate defense representation. The investigation itself represented one of the largest and most complex criminal investigations in California history up to that time. The systematic search of the peach orchards, the coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, and the careful documentation of evidence set new standards for mass murder investigations. The Corona case captured public attention in a way that few criminal cases had before, partly because of the shocking number of victims, and partly because it challenged perceptions about serial killing in America. At the time, serial killing was not widely understood as a phenomenon, and Corona's crimes helped bring this type of criminal behavior into public consciousness. The case inspired numerous books, including Tracy Kidder's The Road to Yuba City and Victor Villaseñor's Jury, The People vs. Juan Corona, both of which explored different aspects of the crimes and their aftermath. These works helped establish true crime as a popular literary genre and demonstrated public fascination with understanding the minds of serial killers. The media coverage of the Corona case also raised important questions about how crimes against marginalized populations are reported and investigated. The fact that 25 men could be murdered over several months without anyone noticing their disappearances highlighted the invisibility of certain populations in American society. The Corona case offers important lessons about crime prevention and the protection of vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of Corona's crimes demonstrated how someone in a position of trust and authority could exploit that position to commit murder on a massive scale. This realization led to increased scrutiny of those who work with vulnerable populations. The case also highlighted the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, even when the missing individuals are from marginalized communities. The fact that so many men could disappear without their absences being noted or investigated showed the need for better systems to track and protect vulnerable workers. Perhaps most importantly, the Corona case demonstrated the deadly consequences of untreated mental illness combined with access to vulnerable victims. Corona's documented history of schizophrenia and violent behavior should have disqualified him from positions of authority over others, but the lack of oversight allowed him to continue operating until it was too late for his victims. Today, the peach orchards along the Feather River continue to produce fruit, and migrant workers still come to harvest the crops much as they did in 1971. The agricultural economy that drew Corona's victims to Sutter County remains largely unchanged, and many of the vulnerabilities that made them easy targets persist to this day. The Corona case serves as a reminder that serial killers often exploit the gaps in society's safety net, targeting those who are least likely to be missed and least likely to be protected. In Corona's systematic murder of 25 men, we see not just the work of a deranged individual, but the deadly consequences of a society that fails to adequately protect its most vulnerable members. The 25 victims of Juan Corona were more than just statistics in a criminal case. They were men who had come to America seeking opportunity and instead found only violence and death. Their stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of allowing predators to operate unchecked and the importance of vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Juan Corona died in prison on March 4, 2019, after serving 48 years for the murders of 25 migrant farm workers. He remains one of America's most prolific convicted serial killers. This documentary is dedicated to the memory of his victims and to the ongoing struggle for justice and protection for America's migrant worker population. The story of Juan Corona is more than a tale of violence. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when the invisible remain unseen. 25 men came to California chasing a dream and instead were buried beneath its soil. They weren't just victims of a machete, but of a system that failed to see them as people worth protecting. True crime isn't just about the killers. It's about the stories of the forgotten, the overlooked, and the betrayed. We tell their stories because someone has to remember, someone has to care. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. Every click helps us honor the lost, expose the truth, and keep their names from fading into silence. Because in the end, justice starts with being remembered.